As the crowd roars with laughter, Booth takes aim.
And so that moment where the whole future looked like it had finally lifted, the clouds had separated, comes crashing down.
Imagine discovering a single document, a forgotten piece of paper buried in an archive for centuries. A document so dangerous to a nation's official story that if it had surfaced at the wrong moment, it could have changed how history remembers one of the most famous people who ever lived. Now, here's the strange part. The document wasn't forged. It wasn't hidden by conspiracy theorists, and it wasn't discovered last week. It has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Historians saw it. Researchers cataloged it. Governments knew about it. Yet almost nobody talks about what it actually means. Because once you follow the trail it leaves behind, you don't just uncover a family secret. You uncover a mystery that stretches across continents, across centuries, and possibly across entire civilizations. A mystery connected to a bloodline that was never supposed to be questioned. And when modern DNA technology finally entered the story, researchers expected answers. Instead, they found something far stranger. A genetic signature so rare that even specialists struggled to explain what they were looking at. A signature that didn't belong where it was found. And the deeper investigators looked, the more one question refused to go away. Was history hiding the truth? Or was the truth hiding from history? Because before this story ends, we'll uncover a forgotten scandal, a buried family mystery, a DNA result that shocked genealogists, and a question that still doesn't have a definitive answer today. The official story says we already know who this person was. The evidence says otherwise, and it all begins with a document that should never have survived. The story begins in a place that no longer exists, not because it was destroyed, but because time erased it so completely that today, most people drive past the location without realizing what once stood there. 200 years ago, this place was alive. Children ran through its dirt roads. Merchants traded goods from distant lands. Families built their futures there. And among those families was one whose name would eventually become known around the world. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Nothing about them suggested history would remember them. No wealth, no power, no noble title, just another family trying to survive in an unforgiving world. But beneath that ordinary appearance was a problem that had existed for years, one nobody wanted to discuss publicly. Because in that era, certain truths could destroy reputations. Entire families learned to stay silent. Records disappeared, stories changed, and uncomfortable questions were left unanswered. The people living there knew something wasn't right. They whispered about it. They speculated behind closed doors, but nobody wanted to put those suspicions into writing. Then, one day, someone did. A formal record was created, a document carrying names, dates, accusations, and details that would survive long after everyone involved was gone. For years, it sat quietly in the archives, ignored, overlooked, until researchers began comparing it with something nobody living in that era could have imagined: DNA. And that's when a simple family mystery suddenly became something much bigger. Because the records were telling one story, the genetics were telling another. And the gap between those two stories would lead investigators into one of the strangest historical puzzles ever connected to a famous bloodline. But before we get to the DNA, we need to understand the woman at the center of it all. A woman whose name appears in the records, yet whose true origins remain one of history's most frustrating mysteries. And once you learn what happened to her, you'll understand why generations spent so much effort trying to keep this story buried. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand her, because every strange clue, every missing record, every contradiction in the historical timeline eventually points back to a single woman. And the strange thing is, the more historians studied her life, the less certain they became about who she actually was. On paper, her story looks simple. A woman born into the American frontier, raised in difficult circumstances, living through an era where survival mattered far more than legacy, the kind of person history usually forgets. But this wasn't an ordinary woman, because decades after her death, researchers began discovering gaps in her story that shouldn't have existed. Basic questions had no clear answers. Who exactly were her parents? Why did different records tell different versions of her origins? Why did some family accounts completely contradict others? And perhaps most importantly, why did people who knew the truth seem so reluctant to talk about it? At first, historians assumed the answer was simple. Records from the frontier period are often incomplete. Documents get lost. Names get misspelled. Stories change over generations. Nothing unusual there, except this wasn't one missing document, or two, or three. It was an entire pattern, a trail of inconsistencies stretching across decades. Every time researchers thought they had solved one piece of the puzzle, another contradiction appeared, and eventually, two completely different theories emerged. According to one version of history, her ancestry was straightforward. Nothing mysterious, nothing controversial, just a normal family line stretching back through colonial America. But another group of researchers disagreed completely. They argued that nearly everything people believed about her origins was wrong. Wrong family, wrong ancestry, possibly even the wrong identity. For more than a century, historians fought over which version was true. Books were written, arguments exploded, entire family histories were built around opposing conclusions. And despite all that research, nobody could prove either side, not definitively. Because the one thing everyone needed, the evidence capable of ending the debate forever, didn't exist yet. At least not in a form anyone could access. Then, technology caught up with history. And for the first time, researchers gained access to evidence that couldn't lie, couldn't forget, and couldn't be altered by family legends. DNA. What happened next settled one mystery forever. But it opened a far bigger one. Because the genetic results didn't just challenge the historical record. They revealed a signature so rare that even specialists were stunned by what they were seeing. And once that result appeared on the screen, the entire investigation changed direction. For more than 100 years, historians argued. One side believed the mystery had already been solved. The other insisted the official story was wrong. Neither side could prove it. Then genetics entered the investigation. And suddenly, the debate wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about evidence. Researchers began tracking living descendants connected through an unbroken maternal line. The logic was simple. Unlike most DNA, mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child for countless generations. It's like a genetic time capsule, a biological record that survives even when documents don't, even when names disappear, even when history forgets. The team expected the testing to settle one question: which version of the family story was true? What they didn't expect was that the results would create an entirely new mystery. When the samples came back, the answer was immediate. One theory collapsed overnight. A century of speculation was finished. The DNA clearly showed which family line was authentic. The historical debate was over. But then researchers looked deeper. And that's when they found it. A genetic marker. A specific maternal signature. Rare. Exceptionally rare. The kind of result that makes experts double-check their data. Then, check it again. And again. Because statistically, it wasn't supposed to be there. The bloodline carried a genetic signature found in only a tiny fraction of the world's population. Not just uncommon, extraordinary. A lineage so unusual that tracing its true origin became a mystery in itself. And here's what made the discovery even stranger. The genetic signature didn't neatly match the ancestry everyone expected. Instead, it pointed toward regions, migrations, and populations that raised far more questions than answers. Suddenly, researchers weren't asking, which family was correct? They were asking, where did this bloodline actually come from? Some theories pointed toward ancient populations from the Near East. Others suggested connections to groups that spent centuries hiding their identities. Groups that changed names, changed languages, and sometimes erased their own histories simply to survive. No one could prove any single explanation, but everyone agreed on one thing. The official story was incomplete. Something was missing. And the deeper historians looked, the more one detail began to stand out. Not the DNA, not the documents, not even the family records. The silence. Because the person at the center of this story had spent an entire lifetime avoiding these questions. Almost as if they already knew. Almost as if they understood there was something hidden inside their family history long before science ever confirmed it. And when we examine that silence, the mystery becomes even harder to ignore. Because what this person chose not to say may be more revealing than anything they ever did. For more than a century, historians argued over the same question. Who exactly was Lucy Hanks? And where did Abraham Lincoln's maternal bloodline truly come from? One group believed the answer had already been found in old family records. Another insisted those records were wrong. Books were written. Family trees were redrawn. Entire careers were built around competing theories. Yet despite all the research, nobody could prove their case beyond doubt. Then technology arrived with something historians had never possessed before: DNA. Unlike old documents, DNA doesn't care about family legends. It doesn't care about assumptions, political narratives, or stories repeated over generations. It simply carries information forward, silently preserving clues from the past. Researchers began studying descendants connected to Lincoln's maternal line through an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters. The focus was mitochondrial DNA, a special type of genetic material passed almost unchanged from mother to child. If anyone could settle the mystery once and for all, it would be this evidence. When the results came back, one side of the debate collapsed immediately. The data clearly showed which family line was authentic. A question that had divided historians for generations was finally answered. But what happened next was completely unexpected. As researchers examined the deeper genetic details, they noticed something unusual. Lincoln's maternal line carried an extremely rare mitochondrial haplogroup known as X1C. At first, that might sound like a random scientific label, but to geneticists, it was astonishing. This wasn't a signature commonly associated with the typical English or Scots-Irish ancestry that most people assumed for frontier families of that era. In fact, the genetic marker was so rare that it appears in only a tiny fraction of the global population. Researchers checked the results again, then again. The answer didn't change. The same rare signature kept appearing throughout Lincoln's maternal line. Suddenly, the investigation was no longer about identifying a missing father or settling a family dispute. It had become something much bigger. If this rare genetic signature wasn't typical for the ancestry historians expected, then where had it come from? And more importantly, why did Lincoln seem so reluctant to discuss the very side of the family connected to it? The DNA had solved one mystery, but it had opened a far larger one. Because the deeper researchers looked into the origins of haplogroup X1C, the more they realized they were stepping into territory where history, genetics, and centuries-old secrets began to overlap. The story officially begins in 1789, decades before Abraham Lincoln was born. In Mercer County, Virginia, a grand jury handed down a criminal indictment against a woman named Lucy Hanks. The charge was fornication, a legal term used at the time when an unmarried woman gave birth to a child outside of marriage. Today, that might not sound shocking, but in 18th century America, it could follow a family for generations. The child at the center of that indictment was a little girl named Nancy. Years later, that same Nancy Hanks would become the mother of Abraham Lincoln. Think about that for a moment. One of the most celebrated figures in American history traced his maternal line back to a court case that most history textbooks never mention. And this wasn't a rumor or family legend. The document still exists. Historians have examined it. Researchers have verified it. The record is real. But the indictment raises an uncomfortable question. If Nancy Hanks was born outside of marriage, then who was her father? Surprisingly, no one can answer that with certainty. For more than a century, historians have argued over the identity of the man who helped create Lincoln's maternal bloodline. Some believed the answer was hidden in old family records. Others thought the truth had been deliberately buried. And the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the story became. What's even more fascinating is Lincoln's own silence on the matter. He was a man who discussed poverty, politics, personal failure, and even his deepest struggles. Yet when conversations turned toward his mother's ancestry, witnesses often described him becoming unusually reserved. Not angry, not embarrassed, just careful. as though there were parts of the story he preferred not to place into the public record. That silence alone might not mean much, but when you combine it with the missing father, the court indictment, and the contradictions scattered throughout the family history, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern suggesting there was far more to Nancy Hanks's origins than anyone publicly admitted. And as historians would eventually discover, the mystery wasn't confined to a single missing name. It extended into an entire family tree, one that would split researchers into rival camps for more than 100 years, each convinced they had uncovered the truth. For most of his life, Abraham Lincoln avoided discussing his mother's family in any real detail. That alone isn't unusual. Many people in the 19th century knew very little about their ancestors beyond a few generations. But Lincoln's silence felt different. He wasn't someone who avoided difficult topics. In fact, he often spoke openly about his failures, his struggles, and even his deepest insecurities. Yet, when it came to Nancy Hanks and her origins, a strange silence settled over the conversation. Then, after Lincoln's death, a man named William Herndon published an account that would ignite controversy across the country. Herndon wasn't a distant observer. He had been Lincoln's law partner for 16 years. He worked beside him day after day, long before Lincoln became president. After the assassination, Herndon spent years interviewing friends, relatives, neighbors, and anyone who had known Lincoln personally. His goal was simple: uncover the real man behind the legend. But during that process, Herndon revealed something explosive. According to his account, Lincoln once confided in him privately about his mother's origins. Lincoln allegedly claimed that Nancy Hanks was born under circumstances that respectable society preferred not to discuss. More importantly, he suggested that the truth about her ancestry was far more complicated than the public understood. When Herndon published these claims, critics immediately attacked him. Newspapers accused him of spreading rumors. Historians questioned his memory. Others claimed he had exaggerated stories simply to sell books. For decades, many scholars dismissed the account altogether. Yet, there was a problem. The more researchers examined the historical record, the more pieces seemed to align with what Herndon had reported. The 1789 indictment existed. The uncertainty surrounding Nancy's father existed. The missing records existed. And now, more than a century later, the DNA evidence had introduced yet another mystery connected to the same family line. Suddenly, Herndon's account didn't seem quite so easy to dismiss. What if Lincoln knew something that never made it into the official record? What if the whispers surrounding his mother's family weren't simply rumors? And what if his decision to remain silent wasn't driven by embarrassment at all, but by the understanding that some truths were politically dangerous in 19th century America? Because when historians began looking at the social realities of Lincoln's era, they realized something important. A presidential candidate carrying questions about illegitimacy, uncertain ancestry, and controversial family origins would have faced enormous scrutiny, which raises a fascinating possibility. Perhaps Lincoln wasn't hiding from the truth. Perhaps he was protecting it. And once you look at his life through that lens, some of his most important decisions begin to take on an entirely new meaning. When most people think about Abraham Lincoln, they think about the log cabin, the self-made man, the frontier lawyer who rose from poverty to become one of the most important presidents in American history. And to be fair, that story is true, but it may not be the complete story. Because once you know about the indictment, the missing father, the conflicting family histories, and the rare DNA signature hiding within his maternal line, Lincoln's silence begins to look very different. Think about it. He never publicly denied the rumors. He never publicly explained them either. Instead, he focused attention elsewhere, toward his work, toward his ideas, toward the larger story he wanted the country to hear. And maybe that wasn't an accident. By the time Lincoln entered national politics, America was deeply divided. Questions about family background, social status, religion, and ancestry could destroy reputations overnight. Public figures were expected to fit a particular image. Any uncertainty surrounding a candidate's origins could become a weapon. Lincoln understood politics better than most people around him. He understood which battles mattered, and perhaps he understood which battles could never truly be won. So rather than defend every rumor or explain every mystery, he simply let the questions remain unanswered. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Many historians have pointed out that Lincoln possessed an unusual ability to empathize with outsiders. Again and again, his speeches returned to the same themes: dignity, equality, human worth, and the idea that a person's value should never be determined by the circumstances of their birth. To modern ears, those ideas sound obvious. In Lincoln's America, they were revolutionary. And when you look back at his family history, it's difficult not to notice the connection. His mother came from a family surrounded by questions. His grandmother carried the stigma of a public indictment. His maternal ancestry remains uncertain even today, and his bloodline appears to trace back to a population whose full story has yet to be identified. Whether any of that directly shaped Lincoln's worldview is something historians can never prove. But it does raise a remarkable question. What if the man who fought to preserve human dignity understood, on a deeply personal level, what it meant to come from a history that others wanted to ignore? Because if that's true, then the mystery isn't just about Lincoln's ancestry. It's about how hidden histories can shape the people who carry them. And that brings us to the final piece of this story: the difference between what we know and what we can only suspect. After all the investigations, all the arguments, all the DNA testing, and all the years of research, we're left with a strange reality. Some parts of this story are no longer debated. The 1789 indictment existed. Nancy Hanks was born outside of marriage. The historical record surrounding her family contains significant gaps and contradictions. And the DNA evidence confirmed that Lincoln's maternal line carried a remarkably rare genetic signature. Those facts are real, but beyond those facts lies a territory where certainty begins to disappear. We don't know who fathered Lucy Hanks. We don't know exactly where haplogroup X1C entered Lincoln's maternal line. We don't know whether Lincoln fully understood the origins of his ancestry. And we don't know whether those family mysteries influenced the decisions that would later shape a nation. History rarely gives us complete answers. Most of the time, it leaves us fragments. A document here, a letter there, a forgotten story passed through generations. And sometimes, if we're lucky, a strand of DNA carrying a message from a world that no longer exists. What's remarkable about Abraham Lincoln isn't that his ancestry contained mysteries. Almost every family tree eventually reaches unanswered questions. What's remarkable is that the man who became one of history's most studied figures still carries secrets researchers cannot fully explain. The further we investigate his origins, the more we discover that the simple story we were taught was exactly that. Simple. Real life is rarely simple. Real history is even less so. Behind every famous name is another story. Behind every official narrative is another layer waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden beneath this mystery. The past is never truly gone. It leaves traces, in documents, in memories, in bloodlines. And sometimes those traces survive for centuries, waiting for someone to notice them. Abraham Lincoln's greatness never depended on where his ancestors came from. But understanding the mystery surrounding them reminds us of something important. The people who shape history are often shaped by histories we cannot fully see. And somewhere inside a courthouse record, a family secret, and a rare genetic signature carried across generations, there remains a question that may never be answered completely. Not who Abraham Lincoln became, but who exactly came before him. And sometimes the questions history cannot answer are the ones that stay with us the longest. Because the truth is, the story of Abraham Lincoln may not be finished yet. We're still discovering it.